Welcome to Faith in Practice, presented by Higher Powered Sports, PT, the podcast where faith meets everyday life and vocational calling. Each episode, your host, Kurt Kessler, and his guest will explore how to live out your faith in your work, relationships, and daily challenges. Let's grow together and discover how to live out your faith with passion and purpose. Let's get started.
Hey there, everybody, and happy Easter to those who celebrate it. I was originally planning to air a different episode this week, but I realized that it was Easter and I have a topic to talk about, so this episode is freshly recorded. Through the first two episodes, you've heard me talk about my experience at this time last year, but I'm just going to set the scene again and then dive a little bit deeper into the things that were happening in my life, but more importantly, maybe the things that weren't. So I was just weeks removed from taking the board exam for my sports PT specialty, and I talked about the anxiety that I was feeling at that time. Sports residency was tough. I was working full-time, had 10 or more extra hours a week dedicated to education and sports coverage, traveling to Alabama every 2 months, being a father of a 1-year-old, being graded on my ability to perform skills, taking a $2,000 test that is offered once a year, and it was a privilege to have the opportunity to do that. But I maintain that it was probably the toughest year of my life. It was hard to prioritize exercise that year, so I got really out of shape, and I felt like I aged 10 years in that 1 year span. So again, working in the traditional outpatient physical therapy setting, I was seeing roughly 55 to 60 patients a week, standard numbers in the PT industry, working through just about every lunch break because I would travel 20 minutes to an off-site location on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I thought after residency, the pace would slow down and the anxiousness would go away, and it just didn't. I mentioned that I would wake up at 2 a.m. with my heart racing. I couldn't fall back asleep. I would start thinking about the patients that I either couldn't figure out what was going on with them, or how I wanted to prioritize each hour of my day so that I could accomplish everything I wanted to with each patient. I would try to remember how many new patient evaluations I had scheduled or how many evaluation spots were open and could potentially be filled, which would affect the way that I plan my day. For those who don't know, evaluations are a lot more documentation, even if you have a template to follow. So that's what I would do during my 15 minutes of lunch break. And if I was lucky enough to fall back asleep at night, then I was probably up again at 4 or 4:30 in the morning, and the same cycle of my heart rate racing and the same cycle of thoughts would start again. I'd maybe fall back asleep for a half hour until my alarm would go off, which I set a half hour early or a half hour earlier than I needed to, because the only thing that would give me an ounce of comfort was to lie on the floor with my dog. And because I needed the extra time to psych myself up to actually face the workday. At this time last year, I began thinking, I have two options. I either leave the profession that I dreamed of and persevered so long to get into school, paid $90,000 for that school education, and then invested in the sports residency after that, or I find a way to practice the way that I wanted to in order to preserve my passion that I was given. And I didn't know what that meant at the time. My wife and I were one of the group leaders for a young adult group at our church at the time. And our church constructed a Maundy Thursday walkthrough. This was a life-changing night for me. Almost a year to the day. This walkthrough, you go through at your own pace. You're given just a small sheet of paper of things to consider as you go through each exhibit. It's very dimly lit. It's quiet. And you walk in, you start at the table of the Last Supper. They had a long table laid out with all the food that was presented at the Last Supper, descriptions of why each food was represented at the table, and you tasted the food. It was really bland, really dry, but you thought about what it represented. And I had walked into this with a heavy heart. I had a lot on my mind. I had a lot on my heart. I had a lot of questions in my life that I was seeking answers for, and a lot of answers that I wasn't receiving. I felt like I was calling out to God for a solution for months, and it had been intensifying in the weeks leading up to this moment, and I was receiving silence. I moved on to the next exhibit with my wife, and this was a feet washing station where you had a partner and you would take turns washing each other's feet, just as Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. And I am super self-conscious about my feet ever since I met my wife, because she made it a point early in our relationship to let me know how terrible my feet are. And now she had to wash them, so the joke was really on her. But seriously, it is very humbling to have another human wash your feet. It was much easier for me to wash someone else's than to have my own feet washed. Then the next station was the Garden of Gethsemane, and this is where Jesus prayed in agony of his impending betrayal and crucifixion. And I started getting really emotional at this section, because you start to internalize the smallest fraction of what was a reality for Jesus. You start to realize and feel the weight of the ever-increasing world that rejects him, and how wrong it was in the earthly realm for him to be so wrongly accused and persecuted with no merit to the accusations. And I grabbed a few tissues to mop up my tears and to blow my nose, because the weight that I entered with, the weight that was on me that I entered the night with, was now compounded by what I was feeling spiritually. I took a while and reflected at this station, and just sat there in silence, sat there in prayer, sat there and contemplated what it was like for Jesus. And even with the small burden that I felt or had placed on me at that time, it all started to add up. So you exit this exhibit and you go into a hallway where you hear the crowds chanting, "Crucify him." And you wind down a series of dimly lit hallways listening to the crowds ridicule him. And then you come to a doorway and you climb 3 steps, and then you see the cross in a brightly lit scene compared to the other exhibits. And then you're standing under the cross at a table with the 6-inch long, thick, blunted nails that they used to secure him to the cross, and the crown of thorns. And it's just impossible to fathom those nails going through your own hands and feet, or the thorns being pressed into your head. And I took a moment here, and then I entered the last station, which was the tomb. And you entered a small black tent-looking structure, and it is pitch black in there, except for the smallest amount of light that would trickle in at the floor. And you just sat and considered the darkness and the finality of his earthly life. And you exit the tent, and there was just a space to finish your reflection. And at this point, I knew I had taken a lot of time going through this whole thing, but this last section is where I spent the most time. I was reflecting on the experience. I still had the same 2 tissues in my hand from before. I wasn't able to stop the steady stream of tears. My nose was stuffed with snot. The tissues were so saturated that they were useless. I was disgusting, truly disgusting. But the only thing I could think about was, what is he saying to me right now? And I prayed. I sat there. I could not stop crying. I begged for an answer. I begged for an outlet. I just needed to hear something. The silence felt like it had gone on too long. I had prayed for weeks. I had been seeking him for weeks, and I just felt silence. I just wanted to move on to the next chapter in my life, next chapter of my career, but I had no direction of what that was or what that meant. I was ready to walk through that door, and I said in my prayer, I feel like I'm trying to walk through the door, and instead I was just walking into it. Walking into a door and just being stuck there. Like being stuck on the outside, waiting for someone to open the door, waiting to go through to the next, and nothing was happening. And I remember this. The image came into my head. There were 3 separate doors in front of me. And I was looking at each one, not knowing what was behind any of them, not knowing which one was the door I was supposed to walk through. And then I heard a voice in my head say, "You're trying to walk through a door that isn't open yet." The key word there being yet. Yes, I was trying to walk through a door, but I was getting stuck because it wasn't open. And all of a sudden, I had the answer that I was looking for. It wasn't a definitive answer. It wasn't any direction. It wasn't one door opening for me to step through. But the answer was, just wait. I am preparing the next step for you. And I just needed to know that my prayers were heard. I didn't need an answer. I didn't need that door open. I just needed to know that God was there. And hearing and feeling the message was all I needed. The next couple months were still difficult. I was still overwhelmed at work. I was still waking up in the morning. I was still laying on the floor with my dog. I was still listening to Christian music as I was driving to work, trying to calm myself down so that I can just start my workday. I still didn't know what that next step was. And it revealed itself in a painfully slow manner, but it forced me to lean in daily to try to hear what God was saying to me. I had to draw closer. I had to rely on faith to get me through the day. My faith and my patience were being tested so that I could grow my spiritual endurance to keep running the race. And you just think, on this faith journey, we talk about endurance, we talk about running the race. That's a very common phrase. But sometimes you just get caught up in doing the day-to-day stuff. And I knew that what I was learning, the way that I was learning to lean in every day, not only when things were going good, not only when things were going bad, but to try to make that more consistent, to grow my spiritual endurance for what I would need in this next chapter, or what I will probably need at some other times in my life. And this is an experience that I will not forget because the lessons that I learned from it were so deep. And it was a very challenging season for me, but it was maybe one of the most important seasons of my life and one of the most important lessons that I've learned. So my question for you, are you feeling stuck? Are you feeling like you don't know what the next move is for you? Are you feeling anxious or overwhelmed about your current season of life? If the answer is no, then good for you. Enjoy the season that God has prepared for you and come back to this when you get stuck. For anybody else, just take a moment to find that connection. Take a moment to seek direction. Take a moment to just listen for what God is saying. I had the same lesson in the 3 years that I was denied entrance to a PT program. God was preparing the right place for me. Messiah didn't have their PT program yet, and that was the place for me. I had to wait for it to be built because that was the next step. That was the next place for me. And what I want you to know is that your next place is being prepared for you.
It's time for Word Up.
Today's Word Up comes from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31, and it reads, "But those who wait for the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint." The historical context for this is that the Israelites were in exile in Babylon. They're facing hardship and despair, and Isaiah's words are a message of comfort and hope, reminding them of God's strength and God's ability to sustain them. In the verse, God's promise, he promises those who wait on the Lord that they will receive renewed strength, symbolized by the imagery of eagles soaring, running without fatigue, and walking without fainting. And it emphasizes the phrase, wait on the Lord. And it signifies a reliance on God's timing and a trust in his promises, even in difficult circumstances. Some of the symbolism to point out here, eagles are known for their strength and their ability to soar, representing the power and the freedom that comes from trusting in God. The running and walking portion, these actions symbolize the ability to continue on our journey without surrendering to fatigue or despair. And then lastly, the application of this. This verse is meant to be a source of encouragement for believers, reminding us that even in the midst of challenges, we can find strength and endurance by trusting in God. So that was just my experience around Easter at this time last year, and I reflected on that a little bit and just felt like it was something that was worth sharing, because as we go through life, at some point, we're all going to get stuck in some way. We're all going to be waiting for a response. We're all going to be waiting on the Lord's answers, the Lord's promises. And sometimes we don't get the answers that we want. Sometimes we don't get the answers that we're waiting for. But if you stay consistent, if you stay in the Word, if you stay in his presence, one of those doors will open and it will be exactly where you're supposed to be. That's going to do it for this episode of Faith in Practice. Thank you, everybody, for joining. If you want to connect in any way, you can find ways to connect in the show notes and reach out to me at Higher Power Sports PT on Instagram. Thank you all for joining again, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode of Faith in Practice. We hope you found inspiration and practical wisdom to help you live out your faith on and off of life's playing fields. If today's conversation resonated with you, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review. Your support helps us continue sharing stories and insights that empower you to align your faith with your vocation. For more resources or to connect with us, visit hpsportspt.com. That's hpsportspt.com. Remember, your faith isn't just a part of your week, it's a part of your life. Let your light shine.